This conference will now be recorded.
So the first form we've got is the wire fraud notification addendum. Now, obviously, much of this language has been added to both the buyer agency agreement and the listing agreement. So this form is maybe not as crucial as it was before that change was made this past July. But particularly if you feel like you have maybe an at-risk buyer or seller who's someone who might be a little bit more prone to falling for a scam, it would probably still be a good idea to have them fill out, sign this form. I mean, there's really nothing to fill out. You're just putting in their name, the firm name, and the property address, and then they sign. There's really not all that much to that one, and this is just telling them, don't send any wire transfers without checking first. Really, you should just tell your buyers and sellers, don't send a wire transfer to anyone without talking to you first, so that you can verify the information. That's typically the safest bet. The next form. This is actually a really useful form that doesn't get used very often. So, a lot of times when we're on the listing side, you run into the issue that, the contract actually says the due diligence fee or the earnest money should be delivered with the contract. Maybe it's been 2 or 3 days, you still don't have it. This is a form you can use to demand that money. It gives them 24 hours to deliver whichever fee it is. And if they don't, then they can be considered in breach, and your seller would have the option of terminating the contract unilaterally. If you don't use this form, it would be very hard to prove that the buyer is in breach, because you have to have some kind of written notice letting the buyer know that they have not delivered the money, that you're considering them in breach of the contract, and that you're giving them a certain period of time to remedy that breach. So if you don't use this form, it's going to be really hard for the seller to justify terminating from their side. We actually just recently ran into a situation where this form became very useful because the buyer's agent never saw the property before writing the contract, even though the buyers had spent 2 hours in the property before they submitted the offer. The buyer's agent tried to claim that the condition was misrepresented on the MLS and would not send us a termination form without getting an agreement from the sellers to return the due diligence money. So what we were able to do is we used this form and essentially let them know that, if you don't deposit the earnest money, we're going to consider you in breach, and the seller's just going to terminate from our end, and that's going to let us continue. We'll relist the property and move on with things. And it helped us reach an agreement with them because they realized they didn't have all the leverage. They thought that they could just run out the due diligence at the very least and make everything difficult for the seller if they didn't return the due diligence fee. But by using this form, we were able to help our seller get back on the market faster. And again, a really simple one. You're just putting in the seller and buyer names, the property address. You'll pick which kind of money it is that hasn't been deposited, or that, maybe the check bounced. Either due diligence, the initial earnest money deposit, or you identify whichever one it is. And then basically the seller signs, you deliver it. There's no acknowledgement required here by the buyer. And then we've got the response to the buyer's offer. This form used to be known as the memo to the buyer. It's essentially a form if you want to, if a buyer submits an offer and your seller says, that can't accept this, don't want these terms, but we're not that far off, let's send a response to the buyer letting them know that we would be willing to consider these terms. And it's very carefully written here. They use the phrase, we would favorably consider the following changes, because the purpose of this form is to let you send those new terms to the buyer without the risk of it being a counteroffer that the buyer could respond to and say, we accept. So this is, you're letting the buyers know what forms your sellers would likely accept, but it still gives your sellers the flexibility to consider another offer. They might send this form back to the buyer, and then a better offer comes in that they just want to accept outright. They don't even want to negotiate it. If you use this, your sellers are free to accept that other offer. If you make an actual counter offer, the buyers can say, we accept, and the buyers have just put you under contract. And now you don't have any way to accept that other offer. So that's the main purpose of this form. It's something that generally you'll want to use unless your seller's pretty happy with an offer and only has a few maybe minor tweaks to it that they want to make. But again, this is going to be addressed to the buyers regarding their offer on your listing. You'll put the date that they offered it, check the box, and just list whatever changes. It could be, obviously purchase price. You could ask for a higher due diligence fee. More or less any of the blanks that you would fill out when you're submitting a Form 2T, you can suggest those changes here. And you can also, a lot of times you'll see agents put in some kind of deadline in the MLS saying, hey, the seller is going to consider all offers on this date. You can make that official in this form, especially, if you have multiple offers, obviously. You can use this form to do that. I doubt many people are going to use this form for this purpose. If you're just completely rejecting their offer, you're not going to, you're not suggesting any new terms. Maybe they're 25,000 under list price, and there's just, your seller's so insulted that they don't even want to talk to them. You can use this form to say the seller's just rejecting your offer. They're not suggesting any changes. They're not really willing to make any suggestions to the buyer, just rejecting it. You can use this. Like I said, in that case, you're normally just going to send an email. This could be useful in the case where maybe a buyer's agent doesn't believe you presented the offer for some reason. And this would be a way that you could get a seller's signature proving that you presented the offer. They just really didn't like it. And let me know, feel free to stop me if you have questions about any of these forms. Definitely, you're welcome to type them in. You can also unmute yourself and you should be able to talk. So the last form today is the backup contract addendum. This is one that you're seeing used a little bit more often right now. It's something you will typically see used more often in a hot market. In a slow market, it's going to be less common. But right now, this is something that, there's not that much inventory. If a buyer really likes a home, they may be willing to go into a backup position, which can always be a benefit to your seller. And of course, if you're representing the buyer, you want your person to get the first shot if for some reason that first buyer does walk away. The main things I'll point out here some of the most common questions that I get asked about this form when someone does need to use it or when they receive it on the listing side. A buyer in a backup position will deposit the initial earnest money. So they do go ahead and deposit that with whoever the escrow agent is, the attorney or the listing firm. That money does stay there while they are in the backup position. If they become the primary buyer, then the earnest money is already there. And obviously, if the backup contract expires or never, they never become the primary buyer, that they get that refunded. Due diligence, however, they do not pay until they become the primary buyer. Since obviously that's a non-refundable fee, it's paid directly to the seller, there would be no reason that you would want a buyer to pay a due diligence fee unless they were the primary contract. So those are the two most common questions I get asked about this, is how is the money handled? And then obviously filling it out is fairly straightforward. Property address, seller and buyer names. You insert just the last name of the primary buyer here. Because even with this backup addendum, the confidentiality of that primary contract has to be largely kept intact. So you're only entering their last name here. And then you'll move down here again. The buyer and seller agree that the secondary buyer, the buyer using this form, does not have the right to examine the primary contract without written permission from both the seller and the primary buyer. And basically, there's no reason a primary buyer would ever agree or give permission to let someone else look at their contract. I just can't imagine any scenario where they would agree to that. So, they're basically relying on the information that you're providing them here. So you'll put in the closing date that's proposed for the primary contract, the due diligence period. This is one of the few times that you will, by default, use a number of days instead of a date. So this is saying if you are delivered notice that you are the primary contract, your due diligence will last for 21 days or 30 days, whatever number y'all agree on in here from that date. And then again, for the closing date, it'll be a number of days. Now, I pretty strongly suggest when you use a number of days, if this becomes the primary contract, you should confirm in writing with the other agent, hey, I counted the days. By my reckoning, due diligence will end at 5 p.m. on December 31st, and the closing will be, January 10th. Get that confirmation in writing so that you're all in agreement, because what you don't want to do is you think that due diligence ends at 5 p.m. on December 31st, and for some reason the other agent thinks it ends December 30th. So you don't want to wait until the very end of the due diligence period to find out that you're disagreeing on counting the days. The backup buyer basically can terminate anytime. Until they're notified that they are the primary buyer, they can just terminate, anytime, no questions asked, and the earnest money gets returned to them. And there's also an automatic termination that you're going to put in here. For example, a deal that one of my agents is doing right now, they put the automatic termination date as the day after due diligence was set to expire for the primary buyer. Once the primary buyer goes past due diligence, it's pretty likely they're going to go to closing. And so the backup buyer doesn't want to be tied up beyond that date. So it automatically terminates on that date. But you can make that date anything you want. The automatic termination could be the day of closing for the primary buyer. That's really, it's a negotiable term. totally up to what the two parties want to agree to. And then standard signature stuff down here. And then the third page is the notice that the buyer is now the primary contract. So this would be, you would be filling this out if you are the listing agent and your first buyer has terminated and you are notifying this backup contract buyer that they are now in the first position, they're under contract, and they need to, start counting their days, doing their due diligence, and start their loan process. Again, you're entering in the buyer, the date that the primary contract was terminated, and you'll put in the last name there. And then the evidence that you will provide, you will check one of these lines, initial one of these lines. Written release signed by all parties, that's going to be either Form 390 or 391T, which is the termination by mutual agreement, or the notice that either the seller or the buyer has exercised their unilateral right to terminate. That would be forms 351, 352, and 350T, I believe, are the three that could be used for that. And then, D obviously is not one I would expect anyone would run into very often. But if something happens and a court determines that the primary contract was not valid for some reason, it was either invalid, illegal, unenforceable, or just for some other reason that the court determined was terminated, then you would initial that line. But I just can't. So question here, can the seller accept multiple backup offers? I don't think that this form properly accounts for a second backup offer, because basically you're entering the name of the primary contract, and if you have two backup offers, they can't both automatically become the primary contract. So when this becomes, say your first buyer walks away, and you have a backup offer, that backup offer can become the primary contract, and at that point you could accept another backup offer. To accept multiple backup offers would require assistance from an attorney because they would have to draft a form. This form could not be adequately used to have, like a second place buyer, a third place buyer, even maybe a fourth place buyer, that would require, if you were in the fourth position, the first three buyers would all have to fail to close. This form would not provide for that. That would be something that an attorney could potentially draft. So the question here is, where do you get the last name of the primary buyer? You have to get that from the listing agent. And the listing agent should provide that. It's just a standard blank on the form. If for some reason they don't want to give it to you, I would just, send them a copy of this form and say, hey, this is something that the form requires. We really need that. But yes, that would be information you would just have to get from the listing agent. All right, any other questions on this form or any of the other ones that we covered today? Okay, is there a way to indicate in the listing that, hold on. The question went away before I got a chance to read the whole thing. Is there a way to indicate in the listing that multiple backup offers are being accepted? If you have a form drafted by an attorney that can deal with multiple backup offers, you would just put it in the agent-only remarks. You could just put in the agent-only remarks that the seller is willing to accept more than one backup offer, and that the seller has an attorney drafted addendum that needs to be used if there are more than one backup offers made. If there's only one backup offer made, they can just use this form, obviously. If for some reason, and I'll be honest, I would be surprised unless it was just a really, really hot property that was very unique in some way. I would be really surprised if a buyer was willing to go into, a third position or a fourth position, because then you're potentially talking a significant amount of time that they're waiting. Because the primary buyer may go 30 days before they terminate, and then the second position buyer may go another 30 or 45 days before realizing they can't close. So I'd be really surprised if you found a buyer that was willing to go into a position, beyond the first backup offer. But if you did, you could indicate that a seller was willing to accept that, and they would need to use the attorney drafted addendum. All right. Any other questions? So question here is, can a backup offer be rejected? Yes, absolutely. If they send you a backup offer that's $30,000-$40,000 under list price, yeah, absolutely. A seller can reject any offer. And you would not want a backup offer to be signed if your seller was not happy with the terms, because then it would become the primary offer if the first buyer terminated and you couldn't go back on the market to try and get a better one. All right, anything else? Oh, yes. So, is there a form to convey acceptance of the backup offer? So to accept a backup offer, your seller is going to sign the regular Form 2T, and on page, about page 11, where you have all the boxes you can check to indicate which addenda are going to be included with that contract, there's a box on there to check indicating that a backup contract addendum is included and made part of that contract. And so then you'll also have this form filled out. So to accept a backup offer, all you do is accept the contract as normal with this addendum attached to it. Oh, no worries. It's always good to have questions. If that's all the questions for today, though, we will go ahead and wrap up here. Thanks, y'all, for checking in on this. And just keep in mind, we do this every Tuesday at noon and Friday at 1 p.m. If you attend every Tuesday, we'll have covered every form in 12 weeks. If you attend every Tuesday and Friday, you'll have all the forms covered in 6 weeks. And we will try to be sure we're posting that schedule so you know which forms are being offered. I know that particularly some of the forms, like the backup contract addendum, they don't get used all that often. And so when agents do run into them, these are the type of forms that we typically do have more questions on. So we'll be sure and try and make sure y'all know which forms are being offered as well. So y'all have a good afternoon, and I will look forward to seeing you on another one of these soon.